In July of 1976, the Viking lander touched down on the Martian surface. The world was told it found nothing but dust, stone, and silence. That was the lie. One of the first images transmitted back showed a black shape on the horizon, too sharp, too geometric to be rock. The team thought it was a glitch until the lander's second camera confirmed it. A structure half buried in the sand, larger than the lander itself, its surface scorched as if it had fallen through fire. NASA quietly ordered a follow-up mission. I was there when the hatch was forced open. Inside, the corridors were corroded but unmistakably human. Switches, oxygen valves, seats shaped for men, not aliens. Dust lay thick across the control panels, but the markings were in English. Then we found the logbook. Sealed in glass, perfectly preserved, dated 5 centuries in the future. The entries spoke of storms across Martian skies, of systems failing, of crew members dying one by one. The last page described our arrival, word for word, detail for detail, written long before we were born. And yet the book wasn't finished. The last line trailed off, the ink still fresh, as though the writer had been interrupted only moments ago. That was when the lights flickered inside the ship. We told the world Viking found nothing, but the truth is, what we found on Mars wasn't alien at all. It was us, and it was a warning. My name is Jackson Thorne, and I was a propulsion engineer at JPL when this nightmare began. 37 years old, divorced, and stupid enough to think I could handle whatever the Red Planet might throw at us. Hell, I'd spent my entire career building rockets to escape Earth's gravity well. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd end up fleeing in the opposite direction. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in August. Director Kowalski's voice crackled through my phone like interference from deep space. "Pack light, Thorne. You're going to Houston. Classification level is beyond your clearance, but you'll find out soon enough." The flight to Johnson Space Center felt longer than it should have. I kept thinking about the Viking images I'd seen, that geometric shadow against the rust-colored horizon. Every engineer at JPL had theories. Solar panel debris, a trick of lighting. Wishful thinking from people who wanted Mars to be more than a dead rock. None of us suspected the truth. At JSC, they led me through corridors I'd never seen before, past doors that required biometric scans and codes that changed every 12 hours. The briefing room smelled like burnt electronics and fear sweat. 3 other specialists sat around a metal table. Rodriguez from orbital mechanics, Kellerman from life support systems, and Hauser from deep space communications. Kowalski entered carrying a steel briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing photographs that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about Mars, about space exploration, and about time itself. The first image showed the structure up close, twisted metal hull plates, scorched ceramic tiles, and stenciled across the side in faded English lettering. USAS Kronos, Mars Colonial Expedition, 2491. "Gentlemen," Kowalski said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have a problem." The conference room at Johnson Space Center had no windows. They'd designed it that way on purpose, nothing to distract from whatever classified nightmare they wheeled in on steel carts. Today's nightmare came in the form of high-resolution photographs that Kowalski laid out like tarot cards predicting our doom. "Before we begin," Kowalski said, loosening his tie, "I need your word that nothing discussed here leaves this room. The classification level is compartmentalized beyond top secret. We're talking about information that could destabilize governments." Rodriguez shifted in his plastic chair. "Jesus, Director, what exactly did Viking find up there?" Instead of answering, Kowalski activated the overhead projector. The first slide showed the original Viking transmission, that geometric shadow on the Martian horizon. But the second slide revealed what the public never saw, a close-up taken by Viking's backup camera system. The shadow wasn't a shadow at all. It was a spacecraft, partially buried in rust-colored sand, its hull split open like a broken egg. Preliminary analysis suggested the craft had been there for centuries, Kowalski continued. The metal showed oxidation patterns consistent with long-term exposure to Martian atmosphere. But when we examined the design, he clicked to the next slide. "We'll see for yourself." The interior photographs made my engineering background rebel against what I was seeing. Heat shields arranged in Apollo-era configurations. Life support systems that mirrored our current ISS designs. Even the goddamn coffee maker looked like something from the NASA commissary. "This is either the most elaborate hoax in human history," Kellerman said, studying the images through wire-rimmed glasses, "or we're dealing with something that doesn't fit our understanding of linear time." Hauser leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "How do we know these aren't Soviet? Maybe they had a secret Mars program we never detected. Because of this..." Kowalski pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the table with a sound like a gunshot. "Ship's manifest, crew roster, mission parameters, all written in English, all following NASA protocol standards, all dated." He paused, swallowing hard. 2487 through 2491. The folder's contents spilled across the table. Personnel files with photographs of men who looked like they could be our contemporaries. Technical specifications for fusion propulsion systems that wouldn't be theoretical for another century. And nestled among the official documents, personal letters that made the whole thing feel disturbingly real. "Dear Mom, the sunsets on Mars are incredible. Nothing like the rust red you see in photographs. Sometimes they're purple, sometimes gold. I wish you could see them. The artificial gravity takes getting used to, but it beats floating around like a balloon." I picked up another letter, this one addressed to someone named Patricia. The handwriting was careful, measured, like the author was trying to preserve something precious. "I know I promised I'd be home for Christmas, but the return window shifted again. The orbital mechanics are more complex than Earth-Moon transfers. Please don't let Tommy forget what I look like. I've got pictures of you both on my workstation. You're the first thing I see every morning and the last thing before sleep." "Personal correspondence," I said. "Real people with real families. This isn't some science fiction exercise." Rodriguez picked up a technical manual, frowning at the diagrams. "These propulsion systems, the math checks out. I mean, it's beyond our current capabilities, but the physics is sound. Whoever designed this understood fusion dynamics better than anyone alive today." Kowalski nodded grimly. "That's because they learned from our mistakes. Every design flaw we've encountered in our Mars mission planning has been corrected in these blueprints. It's like they had access to our entire development history." "Maybe they did," Hauser said quietly. "Maybe these people are our descendants. Maybe this is what happens when we finally reach Mars." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I found myself staring at a crew photograph. 12 men in pressure suits, standing in front of a habitat dome with Mars Colonial Outpost Gamma stenciled on the side. They were smiling. They looked proud. They had no idea they were doomed. "There's more," Kowalski said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a sealed plastic bag containing what looked like a standard NASA logbook. This was found in the command module. Environmental controls kept it perfectly preserved. The logbook fell open to a page marked with a red ribbon. The entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Historical marker established. Viking 1 landing site confirmed at coordinates 22.5 degrees north, 50.0 degrees west. Archaeological team reports excellent preservation of 1976-era technology. Lander components will be relocated to Museum Section C for permanent display. Personal note: strange to think our ancestors called this place impossible to reach. If they could see what we've built here, well, I suppose they will see it. Time has a funny way of connecting past and future. Jackson Thorne's arrival is scheduled for next month. Poor bastard has no idea what he's walking into. The words swam in front of my eyes, my name, written by someone who wouldn't be born for 4 centuries, in a logbook found on a spacecraft that crash-landed on Mars before my grandparents were born. "How is this possible?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. Kowalski closed the logbook carefully like it might explode. "That's what we're here to figure out. Because according to the final entry, this isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a warning, and if we don't heed it..." He gestured at the photographs of the broken spacecraft. "This is our future." The classified archives beneath Johnson Space Center stretched for 3 city blocks. Kowalski led us through corridors lined with filing cabinets that required two-man authentication to open. Emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow, making our shadows dance like spectres against concrete walls. In 1976, immediately after the Viking discovery, President Ford established something called the Temporal Research Division, Kowalski explained as we walked. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's been preparing for this moment for 47 years. We stopped at a vault door that belonged in a bank, not a space center. Kowalski pressed his palm against a scanner, then waited as Hauser did the same. The lock mechanism engaged with sounds like bones breaking. Inside, the room hummed with computer equipment decades ahead of anything I'd seen. Mainframes the size of refrigerators lined the walls, their tape drives spinning in hypnotic patterns. At the center sat a single desk with 3 items: another logbook, a metal fragment, and what looked like a wristwatch with too many dials. "Meet Dr. Yates," Kowalski said, gesturing to a thin man hunched over printouts. "Our temporal physicist. He's been studying the Mars materials since day one." Yates looked up with bloodshot eyes. He'd clearly been living on coffee and determination for weeks. "The implications are staggering," he said without preamble. "We're not dealing with a simple closed time loop. The mathematics suggests something far more complex, something intentional." Rodriguez picked up the metal fragment. It was roughly triangular, about the size of a playing card, with surfaces that seemed to shift color depending on the angle. "This came from the spacecraft." "Hull plating," Yates confirmed. "But here's where it gets interesting. The molecular structure shows signs of temporal stress. This metal has been backwards through time. We can measure the quantum scarring." Kellerman leaned over the desk, studying the printouts. "Quantum scarring? When matter travels against the natural flow of causality, it leaves traces, microscopic fractures in the atomic lattice. Think of it like geological layers, but in time instead of Earth." Yates pulled up a magnified image on a nearby monitor. "This fragment shows approximately 700 years of reverse temporal displacement." The wristwatch caught my attention. It was obviously advanced technology, but sized for a human wrist. The face showed multiple time zones, but the labels made no sense. SOL3, Mars Primary, Titan West, Europa Deep. "Personal timepiece belonging to the mission commander," Yates said, noticing my interest. "Still functional, still keeping time. But according to its internal chronometer, the current date is March 15th, 2491. I reached for the watch, then stopped. "Is it safe to touch?" "We think so, though I wouldn't recommend wearing it." Yates's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "The temporal field it generates is minimal, but prolonged exposure might complicate your personal timeline." Hauser was examining the second logbook. This one looked newer, its pages crisp and white. "What's this one?" Kowalski's expression darkened. "That's our problem. It appeared 3 days ago, just materialized on this desk during a routine security sweep. No one brought it in. No one had clearance to access this room except the 5 of us." The logbook fell open to the first page. The handwriting was different from the Mars discovery, more hurried, desperate. "Emergency Protocol 7 activated. Timeline contamination detected at multiple points. The Mars discovery was supposed to remain classified until 2089. Something has accelerated the disclosure schedule by 113 years. Possible causes. 1. Temporal echo from original crash site disturbing probability matrices. 2. Observer effect from contemporary investigation, altering future outcomes. 3. Deliberate sabotage by unknown agency, countermeasures initiated. Jackson Thorne's psychological profile indicates 73% probability of cooperation. Rodriguez, Kellerman, and Hauser show acceptable compliance ratings. Kowalski remains unknown variable due to administrative pressure from Pentagon. If timeline cannot be stabilized, activate Protocol 12. Recommend immediate termination of investigation and implementation of false memory sequences for all involved personnel. My mouth went dry. They're watching us, right now, making notes about our behavior. "Gets worse," Kowalski said. "Turn the page." Update. Thorne's reaction to personal information exceeds projected parameters. Subject displays unusual resistance to temporal displacement anxiety. Recommend enhanced psychological profiling. Note: Rodriguez has begun displaying temporal echo symptoms. Subject experiences brief moments of recognition when viewing future technology. This was not predicted in baseline models. Rodriguez dropped the hull fragment like it had burst into flames. What the hell is a temporal echo? Yates consulted his notes. Based on our research, prolonged exposure to temporally displaced matter can create memories that don't belong to you. Fragments of experiences from other timelines, usually dismissed as déjà vu or strange dreams. Have any of you experienced anything unusual lately? Kowalski asked. Dreams about places you've never been? Knowledge of technology you've never studied? Kellerman raised his hand slowly. Last week, I dreamed about working on a space station. But not the International Space Station, something bigger, with artificial gravity and hydroponic gardens. I knew exactly how to operate equipment I'd never seen before. Hauser nodded. I've been having visions of Mars. Not the Mars we see through telescopes, Mars with cities, dome structures connected by underground tunnels. And I knew the layout. I could navigate those tunnels like I'd lived there for years. Jesus, Rodriguez whispered. I thought I was losing my mind, but I keep having flashes of operating fusion reactors. I don't know anything about fusion technology, but in these visions I'm troubleshooting plasma containment failures like it's second nature. All eyes turned to me. I wanted to deny it, wanted to claim I was immune to whatever temporal infection was spreading through the team, but honesty won over self-preservation. I've been dreaming about rockets, I admitted. But not chemical rockets, something that bends space around itself. I can see the blueprints in my sleep. I understand the physics even though it's beyond anything we've developed. And in the dreams, I swallowed hard. In the dreams, I'm the one who designed them. Kowalski nodded grimly. Then it's already started. The temporal contamination is spreading. We're not just investigating this mystery. We're becoming part of it. Yates pulled out another set of printouts. The progression follows a predictable pattern. First, dreams and visions, then spontaneous knowledge of future technology. Finally, he hesitated. Finally, temporal displacement. You start existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. What does that mean? Kellerman asked. It means you become unstuck in time. Past, present, and future begin to blur together. You might wake up one morning in 1976, have lunch in 2491, and go to sleep in some timeline that doesn't exist yet. The room fell silent except for the mechanical breathing of the computer systems. I stared at the wristwatch, its multiple displays tracking time zones across the solar system, time zones that wouldn't exist for centuries. There's something else, Kowalski said quietly. The Pentagon has been monitoring our investigation. They want answers, but they also want containment. If we can't solve this paradox... He gestured at the logbook. Protocol 12 isn't just a threat, it's already been authorized. False memory sequences, Rodriguez said, understanding dawning in his voice. They're going to erase our memories of this entire discovery. Or worse, Yates added. Memory wipe technology is still experimental. There's a 30% chance of complete personality dissolution. We'd become vegetables. I picked up the hull fragment, feeling its impossible weight. The metal seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. So, what are our options? I asked. Accept the memory wipe and forget this ever happened? Or follow this timeline to its conclusion and risk becoming temporally displaced? Kowalski opened a final folder revealing satellite photographs of a remote facility in Nevada. There's a third option. The Temporal Research Division has been developing something called Project Looking Glass, a device that might allow us to communicate directly with the Mars colonists, to warn them about the mission failures. Change the timeline, Hauser said. Break the loop. Exactly, but if we fail... Kowalski's voice trailed off as he stared at the photographs. If we fail, we might destroy the timeline entirely. No Mars missions, no space program, no future worth living in. The weight of impossible choices settled over us like Martian dust. The Nevada facility squatted in the desert like a metallic tumor. From the outside, it resembled any other military installation: chain-link fences, guard towers, and enough warning signs to paper a small town. But the underground levels stretched down for 12 stories, each one more classified than the last. "Welcome to Area 52, Kowalski said as our military escort checked our credentials for the third time. "Area 51 handles alien technology. We handle technology that's too alien for Area 51. The elevator descended past levels marked with names like quantum research, temporal mechanics, and ominously, psychological rehabilitation. At level 8, we stopped. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. Polished white walls, holographic displays, and air that hummed with electromagnetic energy. Dr. Yates led us toward a massive chamber at the corridor's end. Project Looking Glass has been theoretical until now, he explained. The Mars discovery gave us the missing component, temporally displaced matter that could anchor the communication beam. The chamber itself defied description, a sphere roughly 30 feet in diameter, suspended in the center of the room by magnetic levitation. Its surface swirled with patterns that hurt to look at directly, like oil on water mixed with television static. Dozens of technicians in white coats monitored banks of equipment that belonged decades in the future. "Temporal communication array," Yates said proudly. "We can send messages backward or forward through time using quantum-entangled particles. The range is limited to about 700 years, but that's enough to reach the Mars colony." Rodriguez whistled low. "This is beyond anything in our current technology. How long have you been working on this?" "Since 1947, came a voice from behind us. We turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Dr. Evelyn Cross, project director. We've been preparing for temporal contact since Roswell." "Roswell was time travel?" Kellerman asked. "Roswell was our first encounter with technology from our own future," Cross replied. "Not aliens, United States. The crash debris showed the same temporal scarring we found on Mars. We've been slowly reverse engineering it ever since." My head spun with the implications. How many times has this happened? How many future artifacts have we found? Cross consulted a tablet. 17 confirmed incidents between 1947 and 1976. The pattern is accelerating. Something in our future is desperately trying to communicate with our past. Hauser was studying the sphere, which seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "You said you needed the Mars material to anchor the beam. What does that mean?" "Watch," Yates said, gesturing to a technician at the control station. The man inserted the hull fragment we'd seen earlier into a slot in the primary console. Immediately, the sphere's swirling patterns began to stabilize, forming geometric shapes that almost looked like star charts. "The temporally displaced matter acts as a beacon," Cross explained. "It creates a quantum signature that we can lock onto across time. Without it, our messages would scatter across probability space." "Have you made contact?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Cross's expression darkened. Twice, both times were disturbing. She led us to a playback station equipped with speakers that looked like they'd been built from crystalline structures. "First contact was 3 days ago, audio only. The transmission lasted 47 seconds before cutting out." She pressed a button and the speakers crackled to life. Static filled the air, then slowly resolved into a human voice. Male, middle-aged, speaking with the careful diction of someone trying to be understood across an impossible distance. "Day 1847 of the Mars Colonial Survey. If anyone is receiving this transmission, please respond. We are experiencing critical system failures across all habitat modules. The atmospheric processes have been compromised by what we can only describe as temporal interference. The timeline is unstable. We have detected multiple quantum signatures originating from Earth, circa 1976. Someone in your era is attempting temporal communication. You must stop. Every transmission creates cascade failures in our reality matrix. Please, if you're hearing this, abandon the Looking Glass project. The cost is too high. The dash. The transmission cut to static, then silence. Temporal interference, Rodriguez said quietly. They're saying we're causing their systems to fail. Cross nodded. The second transmission was worse. It came through yesterday. She switched to another audio file. This time the voice was different, younger, more desperate. Mayday, Mayday. This is Commander Brennan aboard the USAS Kronos. We are experiencing total life support failure. Hull integrity compromised in sections 4 through 7. 23 crew members confirmed dead. The quantum resonance from your era is tearing holes in our ship's temporal shielding. Every time you activate the looking glass array, our reality becomes more unstable. The laws of physics are literally breaking down around us. I'm uploading our technical specifications to the quantum stream. If you must continue this project, at least learn from our mistakes. The fusion containment system has a fatal flaw in the magnetic bottle configuration. The atmospheric processors cannot handle Martian dust infiltration. The psychological screening protocols miss temporal displacement syndrome. Tell Earth that we tried. Tell them Mars is possible, but not this way. Not through bleeding timelines together. Commander out. The silence that followed felt heavier than lead. We were listening to the death throes of humanity's first Mars colony, and we were the ones killing them. There's more, Cross said, her voice barely audible. The quantum upload Commander Brennan mentioned. It came through partially intact. She activated a holographic display that showed technical blueprints floating in three-dimensional space, reactor designs, life support schematics, habitat construction plans, everything needed for a successful Mars mission. But scattered throughout the blueprints were warnings written in red text. Do not use titanium steel composite for hull construction. Atmospheric processor design flaw. Filter mesh too coarse. Psychological profile. Amendment. Screen for temporal sensitivity. Fusion reactor. Warning magnetic containment failure at 73% power. They're trying to save themselves by giving us the information to build better colonies, Kellerman realized. But the act of receiving that information is what destroys them in the first place. Yates pulled up another display showing quantum probability matrices. It's a closed causal loop with a negative feedback function. Every time we try to help them, we make their situation worse. Every time we stop trying to help them, they send us more desperate pleas for assistance. What about the third option? I asked. What if we use their technical data to build a better Mars mission? Break the loop by succeeding where they failed? Cross exchanged a look with Yates. We've run the calculations. Using their improved designs would create a successful Mars colony, yes. But it would also erase the timeline that created those designs in the first place. Temporal paradox of the highest order. And the consequences of that? Unknown. Best case scenario, we create a new timeline where humanity successfully colonizes Mars without the catastrophic failures. Worst case scenario, we collapse the entire causal structure of reality and unmake human civilization entirely. Hauser was examining the holographic blueprints with the intensity of a man solving a puzzle. There's something here. Look at the reactor designs. The magnetic containment failure happens at 73% power, but the system is designed to operate at 95% capacity. What if the failure isn't a design flaw? What if it's intentional? Cross frowned. Intentional how? A dead man's switch. The reactors are programmed to fail if certain conditions are met. Maybe the colony wasn't destroyed by our temporal interference. Maybe they destroyed themselves to prevent something worse. The thought hung in the air like poison gas. I studied the technical specifications more carefully, noting details I'd missed before. The life support systems included features that seemed designed for emergency evacuation, not long-term habitation. The habitat modules could be jettisoned from the main structure with minimal notice. Everything about the colony's design suggested it was built to be abandoned quickly. What were they running from? Rodriguez asked. Before anyone could answer, the sphere began pulsing with urgent rhythms. Alarms blared throughout the facility, and technicians scrambled to their stations. "Incoming transmission," one of them called out. "Quantum signature is off the charts. This is stronger than anything we've received before." Kronos rushed to the communication station, put it through the main speakers. The voice that emerged from the crystalline speakers was different from the others, older, more authoritative, and speaking with the weight of absolute certainty. This is Director Nathan Brennan speaking from the year 2491. I am the son of Commander Brennan, whose distress signal you received yesterday. I am also the final director of the Mars Colonial Program. You know me as the child mentioned in the commander's personal log, the one whose father died believing in tomorrow. I have spent my entire life studying the temporal loop that killed my father and destroyed humanity's first attempt to reach the stars. I'm contacting you now to deliver a final warning. The Mars mission must proceed exactly as originally planned. Every attempt to improve our technology, every effort to prevent our deaths, only makes the catastrophe worse. We discovered this the hard way. The entity we awakened beneath Mars feeds on temporal paradoxes. Each time you change the timeline, it grows stronger. If you create a successful Mars colony, you will give it enough power to reach Earth. Let us die. Let the mission fail. It's the only way to keep humanity safe. The transmission ended, leaving us staring at each other in the sudden silence. Entity? Kronos whispered. The sphere's surface began showing new patterns, geometric shapes that definitely weren't human in origin. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized we weren't just dealing with time travel. We were dealing with something that had been waiting for us on Mars for a very, very long time. The emergency conference room at Area 52 had been sealed for 6 hours. Coffee cups multiplied across the table like archaeological layers, each one marking another failed attempt to solve an impossible puzzle. Kronos paced between whiteboards covered in equations that hurt my brain to read, while Yates hunched over probability matrices that seemed to change every time I looked at them. All right, let's review what we know, Kowalski said, loosening his tie for the 4th time. The Mars colony fails because we try to help them, but if we don't try to help them, they send increasingly desperate messages that compel us to try anyway. Classic temporal trap. Rodriguez was sketching diagrams on a legal pad, and underneath it all, there's something on Mars that gets stronger every time we create a paradox, something that Nathan Brennan called an entity. What kind of entity lives for centuries under Martian soil? Kellerman asked. And why does it care about our time travel experiments? Kronos stopped pacing and turned to face us. I've been thinking about that. What if it's not native to Mars? What if it's something we put there? The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of classified experiments being conducted in other parts of the facility. Elaborate, Yates said, looking up from his calculations. Time travel technology has theoretical applications beyond communication, Kronos continued. If you can send information backward, you can also send matter, small amounts, but enough to establish a presence in the past. Hauser frowned. You're suggesting the entity is from our future, that we somehow sent it back to Mars? Or that it sent itself back using our technology? Think about it. Nathan Brennan warned us that creating a successful Mars colony would give it enough power to reach Earth. What if it's already on Earth, just much further in the future? What if it's using temporal manipulation to ensure its own creation? A temporal predator, it feeds on paradoxes, creates conditions that force us to generate more paradoxes, then uses the energy to expand its influence backward through time. Exactly, Kronos said, and the Mars colony is just the beginning. Every time we try to fix the timeline, we give it more power to corrupt earlier periods. Eventually, it could manipulate events all the way back to the development of space travel itself. Yates was frantically scribbling equations on a new whiteboard. If that's true, then stopping our intervention won't solve the problem. The entity already exists in multiple timelines. It's self-sustaining now. Then what are our options? Rodriguez asked. Kowalski pulled out a classified folder I hadn't seen before. The Pentagon has been developing contingency plans. If the temporal situation becomes uncontainable, they're prepared to implement what they call the Lazarus Protocol, which is controlled nuclear destruction of all temporal research facilities, including this one. The electromagnetic pulse would disrupt any quantum entanglement experiments and sever our connection to the Mars timeline. Jesus, Kellerman breathed. They'd murder us to stop a time paradox. Not murder, Kronos corrected grimly. Temporal quarantine. The theory is that destroying all evidence of the Mars discovery would reset the causal loop and prevent the entity from gaining a foothold in our timeline. I studied the probability matrices Yates had been working on, numbers shifting and flowing like water, showing thousands of potential outcomes branching and converging in patterns that made my eyes water. But one branch stood out, a thin line of calculations highlighted in red. "What's this pathway?" I asked, pointing to the red line. Yates followed my finger and his face went pale. "That's the temporal echo scenario. What happens if the contamination spreads beyond our team?" "Explain." "Remember how we've all been experiencing visions of the future? Dreams about technology we've never seen? That's just the beginning. According to these calculations, prolonged exposure to temporally displaced matter creates a cascade effect. The visions become more frequent, more detailed, until what? Until you start existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. Past, present, and future blur together. You become a temporal anchor point, aware of events across centuries but unable to affect any of them." Rodriguez set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "How long do we have?" "Based on our current exposure levels, maybe 72 hours before the effect becomes irreversible." The weight of that information settled over us like concrete. 3 days to solve a problem that had been building for 5 centuries, or lose our sanity to temporal displacement. "There might be another way," Kronos said quietly. She activated a holographic display showing the underground levels of Area 52. Level 12 has been classified beyond even our clearance, but according to whispered rumors among the senior staff, it houses something called the Kronos engine. What does it do? Nobody knows for sure, but the energy requirements suggest it's designed for large-scale temporal manipulation, not just communication, actual time travel. Kowalski stood up so quickly his chair fell over. "Absolutely not. We are not authorizing human time travel based on rumors and desperation." "What if it's not about authorization?" I asked. The words came out before I could stop them, carrying certainty that didn't belong to me. "What if it's about inevitability?" Everyone stared at me. I felt that familiar displacement again, like I was watching myself from outside my own body. When I spoke, it was with knowledge that came from somewhere else. "I've seen it," I said. "The Kronos engine, not in dreams, in memories that haven't happened yet. It's not a machine for time travel. It's a machine for time warfare." Kronos leaned forward intently. "Warfare against what?" "Against entities like the one under Mars. The future versions of ourselves built it specifically to combat temporal predators. But using it requires a pilot who can maintain consciousness across multiple timelines. Someone who's already been contaminated by temporal displacement," Yates realized. "Someone like us." I nodded, though the motion felt disconnected from my body. "The contamination isn't a side effect. It's a qualification. You can't pilot the Kronos engine without temporal awareness." Rodriguez was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I'm starting to remember things that haven't happened. Technical specifications for weapons that don't exist yet. Combat protocols for fighting enemies that live in parallel timelines." Kellerman's face had gone grey. "I keep having flashes of Mars, not the Mars colony we've been discussing, a Mars covered in geometric structures that hurt to look at. And the sky. The sky is full of holes leading to other times." "The entity's final form," Kronos whispered. "If it gains enough power, it doesn't just feed on paradoxes. It creates a nexus point where all timelines converge. A temporal feeding ground spanning centuries." Hauser was examining his reflection in the conference table's polished surface. "My face keeps changing. Sometimes I look older, sometimes younger. Sometimes I have scars from battles I've never fought." "The displacement is accelerating," Yates said, consulting his instruments. "The quantum signatures around us are fluctuating wildly. We're running out of linear time." Kowalski activated his encrypted communication device. "I'm calling the Pentagon. If we're all becoming temporally unstable, We need to implement Lazarus Protocol before... His words cut off as every light in the facility flickered. For a moment, the air itself seemed to ripple like water. When my vision cleared, there was someone else sitting at our table. A man in his 50s wearing a uniform I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to the Temporal Defense Corps. His eyes held the weary look of someone who had seen too many timelines collapse. "Hello, Jackson," he said, and I realized I was looking at an older version of myself. "We need to talk." The conference room door sealed itself with an electronic whine that sounded like a death knell. Outside, alarms began wailing throughout Area 52. "The Kronos engine has been activated," my older self continued. "Timeline convergence begins in 47 minutes. If you want to save Earth, if you want to save any version of humanity, you need to come with me. Now." The choice crystallized with terrifying clarity. Follow my future self into temporal warfare, or stay and watch reality collapse around us. Either way, Jackson Thorne as I knew him was about to cease existing. The elevator to level 12 didn't exist in any blueprint I'd seen. My older self had pressed his palm against what looked like solid concrete, and suddenly we were descending through a shaft that seemed to bend reality around itself. The walls showed glimpses of other times, construction crews from decades past, futuristic technicians working on incomprehensible machinery, and sometimes just empty space where the elevator shaft existed in different timelines. "Time moves differently down here," my future self explained, his voice carrying an accent I didn't recognize. "The Kronos engine generates a temporal field that isolates level 12 from linear causality. Minutes can become hours, hours can become seconds." Kowalski gripped the elevator rail with white knuckles. "This is insane. How do we know you're really Jackson? How do we know this isn't some elaborate trap?" My older self smiled sadly. "Because I remember this exact conversation. You're going to ask about the bicycle accident next, the scar above my left eyebrow. You want proof that I'm really from Jackson's future." Kowalski's mouth fell open, the question dying on his lips. "The accident happened when I was 8, my future self continued. Racing down the hill behind our house in Dayton. The bike chain snapped, I lost control, and ended up face first in the Henderson's mailbox. 14 stitches and a concussion that kept me out of school for a week." I touched the thin white line above my eyebrow. "I never told anyone that story. Not the details. Because you were embarrassed, because the other kids called you Crash for months afterward." His expression softened. "I remember being you, Jackson. I remember the confusion, the fear, the feeling that reality was unraveling around us. It doesn't get easier, but it does get necessary." The elevator stopped with a sound like breaking glass. The doors opened to reveal a chamber that defied every law of physics I understood. The space was simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with machinery that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. At the center sat a structure that could only be the Kronos engine, a crystalline framework the size of a small building, its surfaces flowing with patterns that showed glimpses of other times and places. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered. "How long has this been here?" "It hasn't been built yet," my future self replied. "Construction begins in 2087 and finishes in 1962. Temporal engineering allows for some interesting scheduling solutions." Cross was studying the engine with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. "The energy requirements for something like this must be enormous. What powers it?" "Controlled temporal paradoxes. Every contradiction we feed into it generates quantum energy that can be harvested and redirected. The Mars situation has been providing power for decades." Yates pulled out his instruments and immediately started getting readings that made no sense. "The quantum signatures down here are off any scale we've developed. This thing isn't just manipulating time, it's rewriting the fundamental constants of reality." Around the engine, I could see technicians working at control stations, but they flickered in and out of existence, sometimes appearing as people I recognized, sometimes as strangers in uniforms from different eras. One of them looked like Rodriguez, but older and wearing insignia I'd never seen. Another resembled Kellerman, but with cybernetic implants that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Are those? Hauser started to ask. Future versions of all of you, my older self confirmed. The temporal contamination doesn't just give you glimpses of other timelines, it prepares you to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. You're looking at yourselves after years of temporal warfare training. A new voice cut through the ambient hum of the machinery. Jackson, you're late. We turned to see another figure approaching, a woman in her 40s with greying hair and eyes that held the same temporal weariness as my future self. She wore a uniform similar to his, but with additional markings that suggested higher rank. Everyone meet Director Kronos, my future self said, the woman who will lead humanity's first temporal defense corps. Present-day Kronos stared at her older self with undisguised shock. That's impossible, I'm a physicist, not a military commander. War changes people, future Kronos replied. Especially wars fought across multiple timelines. The entity under Mars was just the beginning. There are others, temporal predators that feed on causality itself. They've been manipulating human history for centuries, steering us toward technological developments that make us vulnerable to their influence. She activated a holographic display that showed Earth's timeline as a three-dimensional map. Red nodes marked points where temporal interference had occurred, and I was horrified to see how many there were. The pattern stretched back to the Industrial Revolution, with each red mark representing a moment when humanity's future had been subtly altered. The Mars discovery in 1976 was supposed to be containment, future Kronos continued, a way to isolate the entity and prevent it from spreading to Earth. But the predators adapted. They began using our own time travel experiments against us, turning every attempt at communication into a feeding opportunity. Kowalski was studying the timeline display with growing alarm. How many of these entities are there? Dozens, maybe hundreds. They exist in the spaces between timelines, feeding on temporal paradoxes and growing stronger with each contradiction we create. My future self pointed to recent additions to the timeline map. The good news is that we've learned to fight them. The bad news is that the war has been going on for 50 years and we're losing. A technician who looked like an older version of Yates approached with a data pad. Sir, temporal echo readings are increasing across all sectors. The entity is preparing for full manifestation. How long do we have? Future Kronos asked. 17 minutes until timeline convergence. After that, it will have enough power to establish permanent anchor points in every major historical period. I was trying to process the implications when my temporal displacement hit again, stronger than before. Suddenly, I wasn't just in level 12. I was also standing on the surface of Mars, watching geometric structures rise from the red soil like cancer growths. The sky above was torn with holes leading to other times, and through those gaps, I could see the entity in its true form. It wasn't a creature in any sense I understood. It was a living contradiction, a space where cause and effect had been reversed so many times that they formed a self-sustaining loop of impossible existence. It fed on the confusion of linear minds trying to understand non-linear reality, growing stronger with each failed attempt at comprehension. You're seeing the end point, my future self said, steadying me as the vision faded. If we fail here, if the entity completes its manifestation, that's what Mars becomes. A nexus point where all timelines converge, allowing it to rewrite history at will. Rodriguez was examining the Kronos engine's control systems with recognition that clearly came from memories he hadn't lived yet. This is a weapon, isn't it? Not just for communication or travel. It's designed to sever temporal connections. Correct, Future Kronos said. The only way to kill a temporal predator is to cut it off from its food source. We have to isolate the entity in a single timeline, then collapse that timeline entirely. What happens to everyone in that timeline? Kellerman asked. The silence that followed told us everything we needed to know. The Mars colonists, I said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. They're not just going to die from system failures. We're going to murder them to save the rest of reality. My future self's expression was carved from stone. 43 people versus the entire human species across all possible timelines. The mathematics are ugly, but they're also clear. Hauser was backing away from the control stations. This is monstrous. We're talking about genocide on a temporal scale. We're talking about survival, Future Cross snapped. I've seen what happens if the entity reaches full power. Every moment of human joy, every achievement, every life worth living gets twisted into a feeding ground for things that should never have existed. Another technician approached, this one bearing an uncomfortable resemblance to myself. Sir, the entity has detected our presence. It's beginning active countermeasures. As if summoned by his words, the chamber began to shake, but it wasn't a physical tremor, it was reality itself becoming unstable. Pieces of the machinery flickered between different configurations, sometimes showing the advanced technology we were looking at, sometimes revealing primitive construction from decades past. It's trying to destabilize our anchor point, my future self explained. If it succeeds, Level 12 will exist in too many timelines simultaneously and tear itself apart. How do we stop it? Cross asked. We don't stop it, Future Cross replied. We use it. The entity's attack is creating exactly the kind of temporal instability we need to power the engine. Rodriguez, Kellerman, Hauser, you need to take positions at the secondary control stations. Your temporal contamination will allow you to maintain consciousness during the transition. Transition to what? Kowalski demanded. My future self was already moving toward the engine's primary control throne, a chair surrounded by crystalline interfaces that looked more grown than built. Timeline severance. We're going to cut the Mars timeline loose from the rest of reality and let it collapse into quantum foam. And the colonists will never have existed. His voice carried the weight of decisions that had cost him his humanity. Along with the entity, the temporal predators, and every version of history where Earth falls to temporal infection. I realized I was walking toward the secondary control stations without consciously deciding to do so. My hands seemed to know which interfaces to touch, which sequences of crystalline keys would initiate the severance protocol. Around me, my teammates were moving with similar certainty, guided by memories from futures they hadn't lived yet. Jackson, Kowalski called out desperately, don't do this. There has to be another way. I paused at the control station, my fingers hovering over crystalline switches that hummed with temporal energy. There is another way, I said, the words coming from knowledge I didn't remember acquiring. But it requires someone to stay behind in the collapsing timeline, someone to guide the severance from the inside. My future self nodded grimly from the primary throne. Someone who's already been temporally displaced enough to survive the transition. Someone who can maintain consciousness while reality unravels around them. You, I said, understanding with terrible clarity, you're going to die in the Mars timeline. We're all going to die eventually, he replied. The only question is whether our deaths have meaning. The entity's attack intensified and cracks began appearing in the chamber walls. Not physical cracks, but tears in the fabric of space-time itself. Through the gaps, I caught glimpses of other timelines. Versions of history where the Mars mission succeeded, where humanity spread across the galaxy, where Earth became a paradise of technological advancement. All of them infected by temporal predators, all of them slowly being consumed by things that fed on causality itself. Timeline severance initiating in 60 seconds, announced a voice that might have been an older version of Yates. All personnel prepare for temporal disconnection. I placed my hands on the control interface, feeling the engine respond to my touch. Around me, Rodriguez, Kellerman, and Hauser did the same. Together, we were about to commit the greatest crime in human history, and it was the only way to save everything we'd ever loved. The countdown reached 30 seconds, and I felt the weight of every choice that had led us to this moment. My hands trembled against the crystalline control interface as temporal energy coursed through the Kronos engine like liquid lightning. Around me, Rodriguez, Kellerman, and Hauser maintained their positions at the secondary stations, their faces reflecting the same sick certainty that was eating at my guts. Wait, Cross said suddenly, her voice cutting through the engine's building hum. There's something wrong with the mathematics. Future Cross looked up from her monitoring station. What do you mean? The energy expenditure calculations don't match the theoretical requirements for timeline severance. We're generating approximately 40% more power than necessary. Present-day Kronos was frantically checking readings on multiple displays. Either our power estimates were wrong, or the engine is designed for something more complex than simple timeline collapse. My future self's expression shifted from grim determination to something approaching hope. She's right. The excess energy isn't being wasted. It's being stored in a quantum buffer matrix. Buffer for what? Yates asked, though his future counterpart was already pulling up new displays that showed probability cascades branching across multiple dimensions. Timeline reconstruction, future Kronos said, understanding dawning in her voice. The engine doesn't just sever timelines, it can rebuild them, with modifications. I felt my displacement kicking in again, stronger than ever. Suddenly, I was experiencing multiple moments simultaneously, standing in level 12, walking through the Mars colony before its destruction, and somehow viewing the entire temporal war from an impossible perspective outside normal space-time. In that expanded awareness, I could see the true scope of what we were attempting. The Kronos engine wasn't just a weapon. It was a surgical instrument capable of rewriting specific causal threads while leaving the broader tapestry of reality intact. "We can save them," I said, the words carrying knowledge that came from my displacement, not by preventing their deaths, but by rebuilding their timeline with different parameters. Remove the entity, remove the temporal instabilities, but keep the Mars colony intact. Rodriguez was studying his control interface with growing recognition. It's like editing a film. We cut out the frames that show the monster but keep everything else intact. More complex than that, future Yates called out from his station. We're not just removing frames, we're splicing in new footage from alternate timelines, versions of the Mars mission where the colonists succeeded. Hauser's face had gone pale. What's the cost? This kind of manipulation has to require enormous energy expenditure. The answer came from my future self, though he spoke with obvious reluctance. Someone has to remain conscious during the reconstruction process, to guide the new timeline into stability. The pilot doesn't just stay behind in the collapsing timeline. They get scattered across all possible versions of events. Temporal dissolution, future Kronos added quietly. Consciousness spread across infinite probability matrices, effectively immortal but incapable of existing in any single timeline. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Death would be merciful compared to existing as scattered awareness across every possible version of reality, watching infinite variations of the same events play out without being able to affect any of them. There has to be another way, Kellerman said desperately. Some alternative that doesn't require that kind of sacrifice. 20 seconds to timeline severance, announced the automated systems, temporal buffer charging to optimal levels. My future self was already rising from the primary control throne. There is one alternative, multiple pilots. If several consciousness anchor the reconstruction process, the burden gets distributed. Instead of one person experiencing complete dissolution, all participants experience partial displacement. What does that mean for us? Rodriguez asked. It means we survive, but we remember everything, every possible timeline, every decision that could have been made differently, every version of ourselves that might have existed. His expression carried the weight of unbearable knowledge. We become living archives of probability, conscious of what was, what is, and what could be. Kronos was running calculations on her tablet. The energy distribution suggests 4 pilots could maintain stability without complete dissolution. But the psychological effects would be manageable, I said, though I wasn't sure how I knew that. Difficult, but manageable. We'd retain our primary timeline consciousness while carrying echoes of the alternatives. 10 seconds, the systems announced. I made the choice without consulting the others. My hands moved across the crystalline controls, reconfiguring the engine from single pilot mode to distributed consciousness operation. Around me, Rodriguez, Kellerman, and Hauser made the same adjustments, guided by knowledge that belonged to futures we'd never lived. "Jackson, what are you doing?" Kowalski shouted over the engine's rising whine. "Saving everyone," I replied, locking in the final sequence. The colonists, Earth, and ourselves. Timeline severance initiated, the systems announced. Reconstruction protocol engaged. Pilot consciousness distribution in progress. The world exploded into infinite possibilities. I was Jackson Thorne, propulsion engineer, standing in level 12 as reality rewrote itself around us. I was also Jackson Thorne, Mars colonist, working on atmospheric processes under alien skies. I was Jackson Thorne, temporal physicist, studying the mathematics of causality from inside a universe where time moved backward. I was Jackson Thorne, soldier, fighting temporal predators in battlefields that existed between seconds. The multiplicity was overwhelming at first, like trying to watch 1,000 television channels simultaneously. But gradually, training I'd never received kicked in, allowing me to partition the experiences, to maintain my primary consciousness while cataloguing the alternatives as reference data. Around me, my teammates were undergoing similar transformations. Rodriguez flickered between versions of himself: engineer, colonist, warrior, teacher. Kellerman's face cycled through expressions reflecting different lifetimes' worth of experiences. Hauser seemed to age and grow younger repeatedly, as decades of alternative existence compressed into moments. Through it all, the Kronos engine sang with harmonics that existed in dimensions humans weren't supposed to perceive. The temporal reconstruction was working, weaving new patterns into the fabric of reality, editing out the entity's influence while preserving everything else. I could see the Mars timeline as it should have been. 43 colonists living and working under rust-colored skies, their atmospheric processes functioning perfectly, their communication arrays sending regular reports back to Earth. No temporal predator lurking beneath the surface. No doomed mission spiraling toward catastrophe. Just humans being human among the stars. But I could also see the price of our intervention. Every change we made created ripples across the probability matrix. Somewhere, in timelines we'd never visit, versions of ourselves were paying the cost for our salvation. The mathematics of causality demanded balance, and that balance was being maintained by our suffering counterparts in adjacent realities. Reconstruction complete, the systems announced. Timeline stability at optimal parameters. Temporal predator containment confirmed. The multiple experiences began to settle into manageable layers. I was still primarily Jackson Thorne of 1976, but I now carried the memories of dozens of other Jackson Thornes from across the probability spectrum. The knowledge was vast and sometimes contradictory, but it was organized in ways that prevented madness. "How do you feel?" Future Cross asked, though her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Different," I replied, testing the word against the new architecture of my consciousness. "Expanded, like I've lived 100 lifetimes in the space of a few minutes." Rodriguez was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I remember building fusion reactors that haven't been invented yet. I remember teaching classes to students who won't be born for decades. I remember dying on Mars and living to see Earth's first interstellar colony." "The temporal contamination is complete," Yates said, consulting instruments that now registered readings across multiple dimensional axes. "You're all anchored to this primary timeline, but with conscious access to probability matrices spanning approximately 700 years of human development." Kellerman laughed, though the sound carried undertones of experiences no single human should possess. "We're like living libraries, archives of everything humanity might become. And our responsibility is to ensure the best possible outcomes," Hauser added, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom gained from observing countless alternative futures. Future Cross was studying the timeline displays with satisfaction. "The Mars colony is stable. No entity contamination, no system failures, no red lung syndrome. 43 people will live to establish humanity's first permanent off-world settlement." "And the temporal predators?" Cross asked. "Contained in collapsed probability matrices," my future self replied, though he was beginning to fade as the timeline reconstruction eliminated the need for his intervention. "They still exist, but only in realities that no longer connect to our causal thread." I realized I was going to miss him, this older version of myself who had sacrificed everything to give us this chance. "Will we see you again?" His smile was sad but genuine. "You are me and I am you. We'll always be connected across the probability matrix. When you need guidance, When the weight of infinite possibilities becomes too much to bear, just remember that somewhere in the space between timelines, I'm still fighting to keep humanity safe." He faded away like morning mist, leaving us alone with our expanded consciousness and the knowledge that we'd fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. "So what happens now?" Kowalski asked, his voice small in the vast chamber. I considered the question, drawing on memories from futures I'd never lived but could now access like files in a cosmic database. "Now we go home. We continue our lives. We develop the space program knowing that Mars is waiting for us. And we carry the responsibility of shepherding humanity toward the best possible future." "Will we ever be normal again?" Rodriguez asked. I thought about that, consulting the probability matrices that now existed in the back of my mind like a secondary consciousness. In some timelines, we went mad from the burden of infinite awareness. In others, we became humanity's secret guardians, using our expanded knowledge to prevent disasters and guide technological development. "No," I said honestly. "But normal was never an option once we found that spacecraft. We can be something better than normal. We can be what humanity needs us to be." The Kronos engine powered down with a sound like the universe sighing in relief. Above us, the alarms at Area 52 fell silent. The immediate crisis was over, but our real work was just beginning. 6 months later, I sat in my office at JPL, staring at a photograph that shouldn't exist. The image showed the Mars colony in its 3rd year of operation. Dome structures gleaming under rust-colored skies, atmospheric processors humming with perfect efficiency, and 43 humans building humanity's first home among the stars. NASA had received it 3 days ago through normal communication channels, along with a message that made my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. "Greetings from Mars Colonial Outpost Gamma, Year 3 operations proceeding nominally. Atmospheric conversion at 23% completion, ahead of schedule. All personnel in good health. Sending family photographs and geological samples via next supply run. Personal note from Commander Brennan. Tell my son Nathan that Daddy is building him a playground on Mars. The sunsets here are incredible." I touched the photograph gently, remembering other versions where this moment never came. In my expanded consciousness, I could access the timeline where Commander Brennan died alone in a failing spacecraft, where his son grew up without a father, where Mars remained a graveyard for human ambition. But in this timeline, the one we'd fought to preserve, the story was different. The office door opened and Rodriguez entered without knocking. Over the past months, we'd developed an intuitive understanding of each other's temporal states. I could sense that he was currently accessing memories from 2087, studying fusion reactor designs that wouldn't be invented for another century. "The Pentagon wants another briefing," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Kowalski thinks we should tell them about the probability matrices." I considered this, consulting futures where government oversight helped humanity's development, and others where it led to temporal warfare between competing factions. Not yet. They're not ready for the full scope of what we can see. When will they be ready? 37 years, I replied, drawing on knowledge from a timeline where I'd become a government advisor in 2013. After the first successful Mars landing, when they understand that the universe is more complex than they imagined. Rodriguez nodded, accepting the temporal certainty as casually as checking the weather forecast. We'd all adapted to our expanded awareness differently. Kellerman had become obsessed with preventing technological disasters before they occurred, using his future knowledge to guide NASA's safety protocols. Hauser spent his days writing scientific papers that were decades ahead of current theory, carefully introducing concepts that would accelerate human development without causing temporal paradoxes. "Have you been in contact with the others today?" I asked. Kellerman prevented a shuttle fuel leak that would have killed 3 astronauts in next week's mission. Hauser published another paper on theoretical physics that will lay the groundwork for faster-than-light travel in 2089. Cross is working on establishing what she calls the Temporal Ethics Committee, a group that will monitor future time travel experiments to prevent another predator incursion. The casual way he discussed manipulating future events still felt surreal, even after months of practice. We'd become shepherds of human destiny, using our expanded consciousness to nudge history toward optimal outcomes. But the responsibility was crushing in ways that normal humans couldn't comprehend. "Any word from the Mars colony?" Rodriguez asked. I activated my computer terminal and pulled up the latest transmission logs. "They're planning to establish a second outpost near the polar ice caps. Population has grown to 47 with the recent births. Dr. Martinez had twins last month, first humans born on another planet." "In this timeline," Rodriguez corrected gently. "In this timeline," I agreed. "In others, those children had never existed. In still others, they died when the colony failed. The multiplicity of possibilities was a constant weight in the back of my mind." My phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to someone important. When I answered, the voice on the other end was familiar in the way that temporal displacement made everything familiar. "Jackson, this is Director Kronos, calling from 1983. I nearly dropped the phone. "Kronos? How are you calling from 7 years in the future?" "Temporal communication array. We've been using your notes from the Mars incident to develop limited-time communication capabilities. I'm calling because we have a problem." Rodriguez leaned closer and I put the call on speaker. "What kind of problem?" "Another temporal predator. Different from the Mars entity, but following a similar pattern. It's manipulating events around the Chernobyl nuclear facility. If we don't intervene, the disaster will be much worse than history records. Potentially civilization ending." I accessed my probability matrices, scanning forward to 1986 and the branching possibilities around the Soviet nuclear program. In some timelines, Chernobyl was contained to a regional disaster. In others, it triggered a chain reaction that rendered half of Europe uninhabitable. The entity is feeding on nuclear energy, I realized, using reactor failures to create temporal paradoxes that strengthen its influence. "Exactly. We need your team's expertise. The Kronos engine at Area 52 can reach the Soviet timeline, but we need pilots with your level of temporal displacement to guide the intervention." Rodriguez was already pulling up his calendar. "How much time do we have?" "The disaster occurs in April 1986. We have approximately 3 years to identify the entity's anchor points and develop countermeasures. But Jackson..." Cross's voice carried a warning that made my expanded consciousness recoil. "This won't be like Mars. The Predator has learned from that encounter. It's adapted. Fighting it will require sacrifices we haven't considered yet." I thought about the weight of responsibility we'd already accepted, the constant burden of shepherding humanity's future while carrying the memories of infinite alternative timelines. Adding another temporal war to our obligations felt like being asked to hold up the sky. "What's the alternative?" I asked. "Chernobyl becomes a temporal nexus. The entity uses nuclear disasters across multiple timelines to establish anchor points throughout the 20th century. From there, it can manipulate the Cold War, prevent the space program, and potentially erase human technological development entirely. The choice crystallized with terrible clarity: accept another impossible burden, or watch everything we'd fought to preserve get unraveled by forces that fed on human suffering." "We'll do it," I said, though the words tasted like ashes. "I was hoping you'd say that. Temporal deployment begins next month. I'm sending coordinates for a briefing facility in Nevada. And Jackson, bring personal items, things that anchor you to this timeline. Where we're going, it's easy to get lost between possibilities." The call ended, leaving Rodriguez and me staring at each other across my desk. Outside the window, the California sun shone on a world that had no idea how close it had come to temporal annihilation. Most humans lived their entire lives unaware that their existence depended on the vigilance of people like us, guardians operating in the spaces between cause and effect. "Do you ever regret it?" Rodriguez asked. "What we became?" I considered the question, accessing memories from timelines where we'd chosen differently. Versions where we'd accepted the memory wipe, where we'd fled the country, where we'd tried to expose the truth to the public. In all of those alternative histories, humanity faced disasters that we couldn't prevent because we lacked the expanded consciousness to see them coming. No, I said finally, but I mourn what we lost. Our humanity, our innocence, the ability to live in a single timeline and believe it was the only one that mattered. I picked up the Mars photograph again, studying the faces of colonists who existed because we'd chosen to bear an impossible burden. But look what we gained in return. Rodriguez stood to leave, then paused at the door. Jackson, when we go to fight this new entity, do you think we'll all make it back? I accessed the probability matrices, scanning forward through the timeline branches that led from our current moment to the Chernobyl intervention. What I saw there made my temporal awareness recoil in horror. Some paths led to victory, others to defeat. But in all of them, the team that returned from 1986 would be fundamentally different from the one that deployed. We'll come back, I said carefully, but we won't be the same people who left. He nodded, accepting the temporal certainty with the resignation of someone who'd already sacrificed everything that mattered. After he left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the Mars photograph and trying to remember what it felt like to exist in only one timeline. Outside, the sun continued to shine on a world that would never know how much we'd given to preserve its future. And somewhere in the quantum foam between possibilities, I could feel the next temporal predator stirring, preparing to test the limits of our humanity once again. I closed my eyes and began accessing the probability matrices for 1986, preparing for another war that would be fought in the spaces between seconds. The weight of infinite timelines pressed against my consciousness like an ocean trying to drown a single candle flame. But the flame continued to burn because it had to, because we were all that stood between humanity and the things that fed on causality itself. The phone rang again, and I knew without looking that it would be another call from another timeline, bringing news of another crisis that only we could prevent. I let it ring 3 times before answering, using those seconds to prepare myself for whatever impossible choice awaited. Jackson Thorne speaking, I said, and my voice carried the weight of 700 years of human possibility. 30 years have passed since that day in the Nevada desert when we discovered what we'd become. I'm writing this in my study in Colorado, surrounded by photographs that span decades of hidden history. The world outside my window looks peaceful, families walking their dogs, children playing in yards, the ordinary rhythm of human life continuing without interruption. They don't know about the 17 temporal interventions we've conducted since Chernobyl. They can't see the scars we carry from fighting wars in the spaces between seconds. To them, we're just retired government employees living quiet lives in small towns across America. Rodriguez teaches high school physics in Oregon, carefully introducing concepts that will prepare the next generation for discoveries they won't make for another 50 years. His students think he's brilliant. They have no idea he's preventing them from developing technologies that would attract temporal predators. Kellerman runs a small engineering firm in Vermont, designing safety systems that seem impossibly advanced for current technology. His innovations have prevented disasters that would have killed thousands, though the credit always goes to other people. He prefers it that way. Hauser became a professor at MIT, publishing papers that nudge theoretical physics toward breakthroughs humanity will need in the 22nd century. His colleagues consider him a visionary. None of them suspect he's actually a refugee from multiple timelines. Cross disappeared 3 years ago. Not dead, not missing, displaced. She exists now in the spaces between possibilities, coordinating temporal defenses across multiple versions of reality. Sometimes I catch glimpses of her in the probability matrices, still fighting, still protecting humanity from threats that exist outside normal causality. The Mars colony thrives. Population has grown to over 400, with settlements across 3 continents. They've sent their first probe to Jupiter, established mining operations on Phobos, and begun construction of humanity's first interstellar vessel. Commander Brennan's son Nathan is now the colony's chief engineer, building wonders his father could never have imagined. In this timeline, the Viking landing of 1976 found exactly what NASA announced: rocks, dust, and ancient riverbeds. No mysterious spacecraft, no temporal paradoxes, no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened on the Red Planet. The cover story became reality when we edited the timeline, creating a universe where the Mars discovery never occurred. But I remember, we all remember, The weight of carrying memories from erased timelines is indescribable, like being haunted by ghosts of possibilities that once existed, but now live only in our expanded consciousness. Last week, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, the original Viking image showing that geometric shadow on the Martian horizon. On the back, someone had written in handwriting I recognized as my own, "Thank you for choosing the difficult path. JT, timeline 7841. There are other versions of us out there, fighting the same war in different realities. Some have won, some have lost, some have found solutions we never imagined. The multiverse is vast, and temporal predators exist in forms we're still learning to combat. My phone doesn't ring as often anymore. Most of the major paradox points have been stabilized, the critical historical moments protected from interference. But occasionally, usually around 3 a.m., I'll get a call from someone claiming to be from 2089 or 2156, warning about new threats that haven't manifested yet. I always answer, it's what we do. Tonight, as I write this, I can feel something stirring in the probability matrices. A disturbance around the year 2247 near the Jupiter colonies. It feels familiar. Another temporal predator, more sophisticated than the ones we've faced before. I'll make the calls tomorrow. Rodriguez, Kellerman, Hauser. We'll gather one more time, these aging guardians, with our impossible memories and our terrible responsibility. We'll study the threat, develop countermeasures, and do whatever it takes to preserve humanity's future. Because that's what we chose when we refused the memory wipe 47 years ago. We chose to remember. We chose to carry the burden of infinite possibilities. We chose to stand watch in the spaces between cause and effect. And we'll keep choosing it, no matter how heavy the weight becomes, until our bodies fail and our consciousness finally scatters across the timeline we've spent our lives protecting. The stars are beautiful tonight. Somewhere among them, humans are building their first homes around other suns, guided by knowledge we helped preserve. That makes everything worthwhile.